Many thanks for joining us this evening. I'm Amanda Davison-Young. I'm the CEO of The Tablet, and we're absolutely delighted this evening to see so many of you on this call. I'm sure this is going to be a good debate, and we're going to be discussing anticipating the next assembly. What next for the Synod? I just wanted to let you know that Professor Anna Rowlands, unfortunately, has taken poorly today. So she's not going to be on the call, but I'm sure we've got enough to talk about with Professor Renee Kohler-Ryan, who's the voting member of the current Synod and Professor of Philosophy at the University of Notre Dame, and Dr. Austin Ivory, a UK-based Catholic journalist, author, commentator and biographer of Pope Francis and a fellow at Campion Hall, Oxford. Your host for this evening is Maggie Ferguson, the Deputy Editor of The Tablet. So without further ado, I shall hand you over to Maggie. Good evening, Maggie.
Hello, thank you very much, Amanda, and welcome to everybody, and especially, of course, to Austin and to Rennie. So that we're all clear, I think it would be helpful if both Rennie and Austin could briefly tell us what their role is as regards the Synod. They're both going out to Rome at the end of this week. They'll both be there for the coming month. What will you both be doing there? Rennie?
Thank you, Maggie. So I'm a voting member of the Synod, which means that I will be present at the Synod of Bishops. As many of you will know, at the first assembly for the first time, we had voting members who were non-bishops, as we call ourselves, which is an interesting way to think about it. So we're part of the whole discernment process, which I'm sure we'll speak about quite a bit. And we have the opportunity as voting members to vote on the various different motions that go forward. And at the end of the month, that will include voting on the different parts of the document that will be released, which will synthesize everything that we have done and may well turn into the final document that the Pope will issue.
So that's a massive responsibility and a massive honor, I would think.
Indeed. And it feels like both. Humbling, sense of responsibility, sense of excitement, also a bit of a weight sometimes as well, just realizing how much is going on and how much is at stake.
Yeah, absolutely. Austin.
Yeah, and Rennie will be doing it also after flying from Australia just on Saturday, so she'll have very little time to adjust. Heroic.
But Rennie, at the moment, we should tell everyone that Rennie at the moment, it's 3:30 in the morning, so she's quite good at this adjustment. Yeah.
Thank you.
Austin.
She deserves a medal. So while Renee is a voting member, so she has the right to speak and vote at the assembly. I don't. I will be at the assembly every day. I'll be absolutely part of the sessions, but I'm there as a so-called expert. It's a broad term, and I have a slightly different role this month, this October, than I had last October. This October, I'm going to be more involved in the communication rather than in the theological groups. But I'm part of a big team of, we're known as expert theologians and facilitators, who are there to assist in the process. So as well as the theologians and the communicators, there are these facilitators who are the people who manage the group. So just like last year, the assembly will be divided into different language groups of about 10 or 11. Each one will have a facilitator whose task is to manage those groups through the discernment process. So I'm one of a large team. I think we're about 40 or 50 out of the. So the voting members are 368 from 7 continents.
Wow.
And we experts, we're probably about 50. So just to give you a sense of the scale of the operation.
Wow. So do you feel more daunted or excited?
I'm excited. I mean, I felt last year it was an enormous privilege just to be there. It was, and I think Rennie would agree with this, the most global gathering I had ever been in. I mean, all 7 continents there. Remember that this is a Synod of Bishops. So apart from the non-bishops, most are, so 3/4 are bishops, and most of them are delegates of the bishops' conferences of their countries. So you might have, say, I don't know, it's about 45 from Africa, about the same amount from Latin America, and indeed North America. And then you have people like Renee, who are the delegates of the continental assemblies. So 10 from each of the 7 continents will be who are the non-bishops there. So, you just, and then of course, men and women, all the different vocations within the church. We have cardinals and archbishops and bishops, obviously, but we also have priests, deacons, religious and laymen and women. So the sheer kind of diversity of it. I'm looking forward to that because you have some amazing encounters and some amazing conversations. It's a unique event.
Fantastic. So I think we're going to kick off by asking both of you to say in about 5 minutes the sort of history of your relations with the Synod. So when did you first hear about it? What did you feel initially? How have your feelings about it developed? What are your hopes going forward? What are your fears going forward? Rennie, do you want to kick off?
Sure. So it's a great question, Maggie, and I've given it some thought. Thinking about this particular synod, I think while this one's been going on for 3 years, I feel like I've been involved in synodality for a lot longer than that because I was involved in the Plenary Council of Australia. So there I helped to chair a group that was writing what became part of the Instrumentum Laboris. And then I was a voting member and also a drafting member. So right in the thick of things in the Plenary Council of Australia. So when the Vatican asked for members from each of the continental groups, one of the things they were looking for were people who had an ongoing experience of synodality. And I think that that's how I sort of made it onto the list and was invited. When the invitation came through, it came through about 3 different times. So I already felt like I was discerning whether or not this was something that I could or should take on. So it was once, would you mind having your name on a list? And then again, did you know your name is on a list and it's about to go to another list? Is that okay? And then the 3rd time. And my husband and I have a lovely bunch of kids here who are in high school, and then we've got a little toddler as well. So it was a big commitment to leave them for a whole month, realizing that with everything that they're doing, they couldn't come with me. I have an extremely supportive boss. So the Vice Chancellor here at the university was very supportive about me going and very encouraging. And I suppose I talked with a few people. So there was already a synodal process going on in miniature. Talked, prayed, discussed, and then just felt this deep peace when I'd made the decision that yes, I would take it on, and that it was going to be momentous because, as Austin said, it's international, global, I should say. That seems to be the term that we use more now. This has been a tremendous opportunity to get to know people and to hear about their experiences of being Catholic in many walks of life and on many parts of the globe. So there's no replacement for sitting across from a deacon in Syria and hearing from him how it is that he is, looking after his local community. And then, cardinals from across the world and bishops and their deep commitment to their own communities of faith and really struggling with different issues, and seeing how somehow as Catholics we think about the same things, we pray about the same things, we're trying to discern the same things in many ways, but there are deep differences as well. And those cultural differences, you could see them on the assembly floor and you could hear them in the conversations. And that was an amazing first assembly. Austin and I got to know each other. I'd never thought that I'd have the chance to have so many conversations with Austin, with others. We've kept up with each other. So there's been a sort of deep sense of community in the year in between the assemblies. I think coming out of that first assembly, I was joking with a friend. I sort of came back exhausted and I took 10 days off and just sort of hung out with the kids and, did very little because it was emotionally, spiritually, and physically quite exhausting. They're long days, you're taking in a lot, constantly translating in all sorts of ways. So translating not only the languages, because there are obviously several languages often going on at the same time, but also the nuances of language. If a person from one part of the world might use a word and it might mean something entirely different to everyone else at the table. So just sort of working through that a lot. So when I came back, the joke was that I called a friend and colleague, Eamon Conway. after about 5 days, and I said, all right, I think I'm ready to talk to another Catholic now. How are you going? And he just laughed and he said, it was the same thing. It was almost a complete overload. And then from there have been opportunities to talk about that experience, to really consolidate what happened, and to be a kind of ambassador, I suppose, for the synodal process. And that's been quite important as well. Working through the university, I've had the opportunity just to talk to a number of people about what it's about. I think now going into the second assembly, probably the feeling is that we know a bit more of what we're going into. So when I opened up the pack that was sent through explaining the process, giving the schedule, it was easier to imagine what that would be like. I always want to imagine what it's like to be sitting in a room, or, you know, so we're very familiar with the Paul VI Hall now. We're familiar with the way that the tables work. We know how the discernment will work. But I think I'm also filled with a great deal of hope, because good conversations are always established on good relationships. And I think that on the assembly floor, there are many of us who know each other quite well, and we will be, even when we disagree with each other, really very happy to be entering into conversation with each other and into that deep process of discernment.
Gosh, that's fantastic. Can I ask you a quick question? So there are 10 of you from Australia, is that right?
That's correct.
How many of you are
10
women?
from Oceania, sorry. Yeah.
How many of you are women?
From the Oceania group, I believe that a good 5 or 6 of us are women. I'd have to do a proper count, but that includes, and when I'm thinking about Oceania, as you know, there are different roles at the plenary. So I'm a voting member, and several others of us, I think maybe 3 or 4 of us, are also voting members from Oceania who are women, but there are also facilitators. So lovely Sandy Cornish and Susan Pascoe are there as facilitators also.
Fantastic. Great. Well, that was really interesting. It's great that the Vatican is still holding always holding the Synod as a face-to-face, not trying to make it into a kind of online thing which people could join from all over the world, which must be a temptation. That is how everybody's now working. But Austin, presumably it's very important to see people face-to-face.
Yeah, it is. It's all about encounter and the relationships that are built, as Renee was saying, and the deep listening that takes place with the method of conversation of the Spirit. I mean, so many people said last year, you know, I profoundly disagreed with what that person was saying in front of me, but I really understood why they were saying it, because I understood their experience. And I'm not sure. And the idea also of journeying together is, I mean, it's important that we are the same people this year as last year. There are a few substitutes because some people have had to pull out for health reasons, but most of the people already know each other. And that's important because synodality is about journeying together, forming a body, forming a community in the Spirit. To answer your question about my involvement, just first of all, my journey from the very beginning, the bishops of England and Wales asked me if I could be part of the group synthesizing the results from the diocese. So I was a synthesizer from the beginning, and then I was asked to be part of by the Synod Secretariat to do the same thing at a global level. So I was in Frascati in 2022, kind of poring over 118 bishops' conference reports, part of a team whose task was to synthesize the whole global, listening. So and then invited then to be part of these 2 assemblies. So I've been involved kind of from the beginning. And I suppose it's been a huge learning for me. I had no idea how to synthesize or even what synthesizing is, the whole notion of discernment. So it's been fascinating for me.
You thought it was a good idea when you very, very first heard about it? Did you think that's a good thing, or wow, I don't think that's going to work?
I immediately knew that this was one of the most important events in the church's lifetime, and that it was a privilege to be a part of it. And I suppose, having followed the pontificate from the beginning, hearing Francis talk about synodality, I'm not sure people really knew what it was, but I could tell that he was keen that the synod be given, the Synod of Bishops, which of course was resurrected by Paul VI, was given a whole new, it became a genuine mechanism for ecclesial discernment, if I can put it that way, rather than simply a talking shop, which it had been. So, of course, the reform of the Synod has been going on even before the Synod on Synodality. And then when they announced the Synod on Synodality in October 2021, when it began, I was actually gobsmacked by how bold, by how inclusive, by how global this thing was. And I realized this is going to be huge. And I think it is huge. But of course, it's been hard to communicate to ordinary people just how huge it is. And that's a topic, of course, as a sort of communicator that I'm concerned with. How do we close that gap? But just now looking at the working document for this assembly, I'm very struck by how clear and how focused the vision of a synodal church has become as a result of this 3-year journey. And I'm also deeply struck by how much it is a response to a church in crisis or in transition. We're in, as Thomas Halleck has been writing about so brilliantly in the tablet, we're in this time of transition. The church is going to look very different in the future. And it's a time of transformation. And synodality has increasingly become clear that this is the vehicle that will take us into the new era of Christianity.
So you're optimistic about that then?
Well, I suppose optimism would require me to have faith kind of in the institution, in our leaders. I'm not sure I'm that optimistic. What I have confidence in is that this is of the Spirit. I think this is the implementation in a very real way of the second vision of the Second Vatican Council. And therefore, I believe it's unstoppable. It will happen. But I think we're just at the very beginning of this journey of conversion. There's huge resistance. There's a lot of, obviously, ignorance and misunderstanding. And therefore, I think this is going to be, if you like, going to define the next generation of the church. And it won't always be easy. But I'm sure that this is the direction of travel, yes.
So just we're going to look closely at this document, Instrumentum Laboris. But before we go into that, I wonder whether I could just ask 2 questions. One is, so you talk about synthesizing, the reports that have come in from dioceses. And I think I would be one of very many Catholics who would say, well, you're not going to find my voice there because we've never been told about the Synod in my parish. I think there are a lot of people who know absolutely, of course I know about it because I work at the tablet. A lot of my Catholic friends have no idea what the Synod even is. Rennie, isn't that a problem? Isn't that exactly what is not meant to be happening?
Yes, I was interested in Austin's comment that it might be a matter of communication. So I wouldn't mind teasing that out a little bit more. But yes, I think it is a problem. So before I headed off to the last synod, I was standing there in my parish mass, and I remember hearing the prayers of the faithful and thinking, wouldn't it have been nice if they just prayed for the people who were going to the synod? I would have liked that, to know that at my parish church there was this sense of unity with what is going on. I think that part of that may also be something historical. Synods have gone on since the Second Vatican Council, and usually it seems that it's something that is just sort of happening over in Rome. Isn't that interesting? A document is released. Maybe there's some engagement with it later on down the track. Probably in universities, we tend to look at these things a little bit more, but actually your common person in the pew, there is no common person in the pew, but your Christian in the pew is not necessarily hearing about it, thinking about it, because they're just getting on with their daily lives. So I suppose for me, the question becomes, well, what is synodality and how is it communicated in practice? And how important is it that we use the name of synodality? I suppose that's a live question for me right now. When we are being synodal, is it important that we say, now we are being synodal? Or should we just make sure that we are doing what is meant by the whole process of synodality? So that's sort of something that I'm going into the next assembly with in my mind.
Austin, does it matter that we use that word?
Yes, it does. And I think because it is a word that belongs to the church, it is a word that is there from the beginning. Synodality begins in Acts of the Apostles, chapter 15, when the disciples are trying to work out, they're arguing among themselves, as usual in the church. There's a big argument. Jesus isn't around to settle the question. He promised to send his Spirit. They learn how the Spirit is guiding them by listening deeply to each other and experience.
Mm.
And synodos, or concilium as it was known in Latin, defines really the early church, and we lose it in the Middle Ages. So this is about recovering an ancient practice. And it's not democracy, although I think it's upstream of democracy, and Western democracy is actually inconceivable without church synodality preceding it, but that's a historical question. But it's not democracy. It's not a corporate thing. It's not. It is its own thing. And it belongs to the church. And I think we need to own the word, even though people do find it a difficult word and they don't really understand it. But it's our job in a way to communicate what it is and to show what it is, because I think you only learn what synodality is by doing it, by practicing it. And when people do it, they go, wow, this feels like what we should be doing. This feels like what the church has been doing, should have been doing, and we should do more.
Mm. So when I was reading the document this afternoon, I had kind of in one part of my mind all the time what people who aren't Catholics and are dubious about Catholicism might be thinking of it. And it has that very moving and striking opening from Isaiah about then the Lord God will wipe away the tears from all faces and the disgrace of his people. He will take away from all the earth, for the Lord has spoken. And I'm sure I wouldn't be the only one who would immediately think of the abuse scandals reading that, and of people who would say, what on earth is the Catholic Church think it's doing, pretending to listen to people and that kind of thing when it's dealt so badly with that. It's a slightly sideways question, so I'm not expecting us to talk about it for very long, but it did strike me.
Well, I mean, I like the way that the document begins with the image of the Isaiah banquet, because ultimately this is about conversion to a way of being in which we rediscover the joy, if you like, of a church that is open to the Spirit, open to the kingdom, that really is fulfilling the promise that Isaiah makes there, and a church at the service of humanity, and therefore. It's amazing that you read it and you thought of abuse. I have to say I didn't, but I understand the disjuncture that you're referring to. And of course, the abuse crisis, clericalism, so many of the sins of the church, which, by the way, we will be repenting of publicly. One of the innovations of the Assembly this year is at the end of the 2-day retreat, which is next Monday and Tuesday, there will be a penitential service in which there will be, and all kinds of sins of exclusion, of, patriarchy, of abuse, of we will even repent of sins against synodality, which I think many people will be guilty of. But you see, ultimately then this is an institution which is badly in need of reform, as it has always been badly in need of reform, that needs to recenter itself on Christ. And that's what this journey is about. So yeah, that is part of the backdrop. In a way, the institution's failures, and particularly I think the failure in the exercise of authority, and the way that authority is now seen in a totally different way from how it would have been seen, say, 30, 40, 50 years ago, is part of the background to this conversion and underlines the need for it. Yeah.
I think the authority comes up in the document, doesn't it? And I think it's very interesting. Rennie, I wonder how you think the Synod will change our perceptions of authority.
Well, I suppose there's the question of what we hope the Synod will do and what will actually happen. And I think as an assembly, we do need to think quite hard about how what we discern there can make its way to the pews eventually. So I think that the main thing with authority is that there's there's an ecclesiology that needs to carry through everything that we do, which needs to remember that we are an apostolic church and that the bishop's authority comes from being at the service of the people, which is given to them by Christ. So there's that sense of having received an authority. But in Christianity, we need to be very careful that we're not taking on this sense that authority means power Instead, it should always be service. And I think that what we're trying to do with synodality is really to carry out that ongoing act of reform. As Austin has said, we always need to reform. And that's what the Isaiah passage, I think, is pointing out as well, that we're constantly in need of renewal and reform. And that can only really happen when Christ touches our hearts, when there's that conversion of heart. So someone in authority, when they realize that their authority is given to them by someone else for the good of others, will have a very different attitude to someone who thinks, I have authority, therefore what I say goes because I have authority. So just thinking about power very differently is what is going to help us. And what the document says at one point is that synodality ought to be expressed in the church's ordinary way of living and working. This modus vivendi and operandi works through the community, listening to the word and celebrating the Eucharist, the brotherhood and sisterhood of communion, and the co-responsibility and participation of the whole people of God in its life and mission on all levels, and distinguishing between various ministries and roles. So I think I find that very helpful, but also one of the things that I think we need to not lose sight of is that there are very public ministries and roles, and that's very important. There are also ministries and roles that happen. I just think of my own parish, which is an extremely lively parish, and there's something going on all the time. All kinds of ministries going out, from the parish to the peripheries in various different ways. Those are all ministries. I think that one of the
at one point, I was really happy. It talks about the importance of living out your vocation in family life.
Exactly.
That to me, I was very pleased.
Yeah, and that's a ministry, or it's a living out of a charism. It's a living out of and so part of, I think, what needs to happen with synodality is that a light needs to be shone on that in a gentle way, to say that those in authority are not the only Christians out there. That there are ways of bringing Christ into the world. And this is what the beauty of the Second Vatican Council, that the laity are out there in the world carrying out the work of Christ all the time. The language around ministries, I think, needs to be sorted a bit.
But there is a problem, or Austin, maybe you'll say there isn't a problem, but some people would perceive a problem. They have Tina Beattie has in the tablet about what might or might not be possible for women as a result of the synod. Can you talk about that? Because I think it's rather central. Yeah.
So from the very beginning of the synod process, it has been clear, and this is true across the world, that the Spirit is pouring out gifts and charisms on all the baptized, but especially women, and that those need to be recognized. So that has been a core concern. There's been a consensus about that from the beginning. What there hasn't been any kind of consensus about is the whole question of admission of women to the diaconate. It has appeared in some reports, but in the synod process, there has been no sort of consensus around that. And I think part of and Renee's, by the way, very interesting on this, you might want to go to her in a minute, but I think part of the unease about that question is related to the fact that I think the understanding is that here we are about recognizing that now baptismal ministries, as the document refers to them, we're all called to baptismal ministries. The idea that we depend on a priest in our parish who does things to us so that, it's going to look very different in the future. And we all need to be formed, we need to awaken to the charisms and vocations which are being poured out, on us and so on. Now, does admitting women to the priesthood enhance that process? I think a lot of people would say no. In fact, it re-clericalizes the question. It as it were, risks enforcing an existing clericalist model in which the assumption is, that the professionals, the people that the real Christians are the clergy. And I would say certainly, I'm aware Nick Segovsky is on this call, and I'm sure other Anglicans are on this call, but I don't think anybody would say that admission of women to the priesthood in the Church of England has declericalized the church. I think one could argue the opposite. So I think that so the question of women's diaconate, by the way, has not been excluded. Tina Beattie is completely wrong about this. It hasn't been excluded from the synod. It is part of one of the 10 study groups which the Pope has said, right, these are issues that have risen from the Synod. We're going to create special study groups to study the canonical and theological implications of some of this stuff, which is very, very complex, which will then report to the Assembly in an interim way now this October, but will present its conclusions to the Pope next June. That includes things like digital mission, role of the bishops, the role of the nuncios, a whole series of very, very interesting questions, and which have arisen in the course of the Synod, will be looked at in detail by their study groups. But what I would say is, if you look at the Instrumentum Laboris, it is big on women, and maybe I'll leave it to Renee to explain how, just how significant the presence of women and the recognition of their ministries are in this document.
Yeah, Renee, it would be lovely if you can you at the same time say how differently you think a woman comes to the Synod than a man?
Oh, that's a good question, Maggie. Well, in a way, there isn't that much of a difference because we're all Christians coming together. I think that for the most part, at the last assembly, there was not a sense that there was some kind of radical hierarchy between the women and the men. There may have been in some minds and in some ways it may have come across that there is a hierarchy between the laity and the ordained. I do think that we need to separate that out a little bit as well. What I often find is that there's so much said about women and the role of women, but there's not very much said about lay men. And I think that that is certainly a gap that we need to be far more attentive to. So there's a whole section on women, which I think is wonderful. I loved reading through this in the Instrumentum Laboris because what I heard there, and we talk a lot about what we heard, what I heard there was something that was captured from our conversations on the Synod floor. It really made it into the Instrumentum Laboris, a great consideration of how women have been involved in the church from the very beginning. They're at the foot of Christ. They're at the foot of the cross of Christ. They're during his ministry, of course. They're immediately after his resurrection, Mary Magdalene, the apostle to the apostles. There is actually a great tradition, living tradition of really honoring the way that women are Christians and the way that they bring something that is different and rich to the church. So to draw on that, and of course Our Lady as the paradigm of all of this, but to draw on that, I think that as a woman going into these conversations, I had that heritage in my mind. So I was often thinking of what was it like? I often had this question in my mind. What was it like for those women who we know were journeying with Christ and the apostles and doing it? Because they're mentioned in the gospel very often. What was that like? And is this a bit like that? And what does that give that is different from what the apostles were doing, which is absolutely essential. If it weren't for the women who stayed with Christ, and if it weren't for Mary Magdalene, if it weren't for Christian women throughout history, you can just think of all of the wonderful saints, lay and religious and consecrated, some fantastic 20th century examples. Women live out their Christianity in a way that is, as the language of the document uses, complementary to the way that men do. And we would be the church would be impoverished without women. What I find that the document is trying to do, and I think what we're trying to do through the Synod, is to really amplify that and to show it's not that women are missing, but that women have something unique to contribute.
It's just a different, yeah. Okay.
And if I could just add to that, the document is very specific that what that contribution needs to be better recognized, valued, and given, as it were, stable and juridical recognition in the church. And there's a whole series of paragraph 15 of the concrete requests coming from bishops' conferences. I won't read them all, but I mean, it's very, very detailed about the kinds of things which every church needs to be saying, hang on, are women doing this enough? Are there enough women doing this, should I say, in canonical process, leading institutions? Also, I mean, and I think this is the question of the diaconate came up last year in a very interesting way, because I think part of the problem with the diaconate is it became very quickly, after it was reinstituted after the council, a kind of subclerical office, so that the deacon is really seen as a kind of pound shop priest up there on the altar with the priest, gets to say a couple of words, but is associated above all with that. And a deacon said very powerfully, a Belgian deacon said very powerfully, at the synod, look, that's not what the diaconate was in the early church. We are diaconia, it's the service of all. So I think what the document's getting at is we need diaconia, and it needs to be exercised by all the baptized, including and especially women. And that includes preaching. There's a lot there about, people should preach that, and so on. So what you're seeing here is a very interesting discernment about what is properly pertains to the clerical office, to ordination, and what doesn't. And that is part of a broader process, which I think synodality is really, really helping.
Fantastic. So I don't want to run out of time, and at Austin's suggestion, we're going to look quickly at the three main sort of areas that this document touches, and if both of you maybe could respond to them fairly briefly, because I imagine are there some questions, Amanda, coming in?
Not at the moment, but if
not at the moment, okay, all right. Well, that's good, really. So the first one is relations. Which is about recovering the dynamism of Christian initiation and a church that invites us all to discover our charisms and ministries, as well as those that are called for at this time. So it's a little bit what we've been talking about, but if you have anything more to say about that, that'd be great. Otherwise, we can move on.
Just to reinforce this idea, I think what we're seeing here very clearly emerging is the idea that baptism in itself confers gifts, and that it is the responsibility, if you like, of all the baptized to discern and embrace their calling, those gifts, and for the church in turn to recognize that. So we're getting a very strong emphasis in this document on the need to recover the dynamic of Christian initiation, the importance of formation, the importance of the acceptance of people's responsibility, that charisms and ministries require formation, but they also require accountability. And so I think that whole first part of the document, which is about the relationships in the church, is really all about the awakening of as it were, the baptized. It's also about having, therefore, a proper relationship between the ordained and the non-ordained, the way that authority is exercised, which we go into more later in the document. But the idea that actually the clergy and the Episcopal ministry is all at the service of the building up of the body. And what I was very struck by in paragraph 34 is very, very strongly worded. It seems appropriate to create a recognized and properly instituted ministry of listening and accompaniment. And I think any of you who've been following, say, Thomas Halleck's articles on this, the future of the church, in a way, lies with engaging with the seekers and the searchers. We as a church have to learn how to accompany and listen people seeking and searching. It's simply not enough to stay in our parishes anymore. So I was very struck by that.
Austin, I've just noticed actually that Tina Beattie is in the audience, has a question, and we ought to bring her in at this point because having just mentioned her. Tina, are you there? Can you unmute?
Yep. Hold on, let me come back. Whoops.
There. Great.
Okay. Well, I mean, I suppose I have concerns that I'm trying to understand whether our two speakers, and this is really interesting, are see themselves as ambassadors for the laity or as being invited because their opinions are fit more or less with what the bishops are likely to vote on, because there are different perspectives on the significance of ordination, for example. I would not argue from a position of power. I know that Renee is on record as saying this is all about power and it's not appropriate, but actually it's about sacramentality. It's about whether the female body bears the image of Christ and is redeemed. That's a really fundamental question. And as the church stands at the moment, the female body only has negative significance in sacramental terms. Everything that the church does can happen without female bodies. So it concerns me. I respect that you're entitled to your opinions, but if you're there representing all of us, I haven't heard one of you really answer the question Maggie started with, about some of the fears that might need to be expressed, even if you don't agree with them. Do you not have a responsibility to listen and represent different points of view, even if you don't agree with them? Or is that not your role?
Rennie.
So it's a very interesting question about the role, and the whole question of representation, who it is that we're representing when we're at the assembly. Is something that a lot of us have given a lot of thought to. So I'm there as a representative of the Oceania group. And so going into all of the conversations, yes, in a way, I'm representing lay people. But in a way, I'm also representing people from a very diverse region here in Australia. And so I've had to listen to what they have had to say. But all of this listening needs to constantly happen, taking into account the deep tradition and the teaching of the church. And so I see it as my role as a layperson to constantly be listening, but also synthesizing, if that's the right term, with church teaching and trying to understand where church teaching is coming from. And that's probably where we would disagree about the sacramentality of the female body, because I see that as constantly present through the nuptial mystery that is going on at every Eucharist.
That has nothing to do with female bodies. The church is a woman. You don't need a female body there to celebrate the nuptial mystery of the Eucharist.
So I suppose my issue with that is that, again, it's saying that everything is about the priest, and everything is not only about the priest. When we're there in Mass together, there is something going on that is not only about the priest, and it is beyond the priest. So without the whole body of the church, which we take to be feminine, female, nothing happens. But I mean, I think that probably we could talk about that a great bit, just to go back to the question of representation. In the conversations that we have, do we raise, the points that you were raising, the points that I know through feminist philosophy as a philosopher? Absolutely, always bringing up all of the different issues. But we're also asked as members of the assembly to be prayerfully discerning what it is that we think that the Spirit is saying to us individually, and to speak that so that it is out in the open. So please don't be afraid that the views that you are putting forward are not there on the floor. They are. There is a great diversity of views, but would it be remiss of us to express views that are not our own only? I think it certainly would. So what we have to do is to be true to what it is that our experience tells us, that our own formation tells us as we're in there.
Austin, I mean, you were quite clear that you thought Tina had misunderstood what was being said about female deacons, so perhaps we ought to deal with that.
Well, I mean, so here I'm now speaking, not representing anybody, or simply as somebody who has observed from the beginning, who has read the reports, and whose task it was, as it were, to understand where are the convergences. So where is there, if you like, a consensus? Not unanimity, there will never be unanimity, but where is there consensus? What, if you like, is important to the body? And what I object to with some of the exponents of the female diaconate is the idea that this was called for. There was a consensus or a convergence in all the reports on this. There really wasn't. It is a proposal. And there are many people who feel strongly yes. There are many people who feel strongly against it. In the Instrumentum Laboris, I think it captures it quite nicely by saying some of the local churches are in favour and some of them are against. I think that's an accurate summary. But there was never any kind of convergence. That's the distinction I want to draw between the convergence that, yes, that women's ministries need to be recognised and so on, in the way I was saying earlier, but not to confuse that with the female diaconate, which was the proposal of some, and not even, I would say, many or most of the reports. However, it hasn't been ignored. It has been taken up, and that's my other beef with some of the things that Tina has been saying. It hasn't been excluded. Far from it. The Pope is very definite that this is going to be taken up by this study group, which is adjacent to the Synod and will inform the Synod's deliberations.
Can you tell us the names of that study group? It's the only one whose composition hasn't been made public. Do you know?
Right. No, I don't, but I understand that it will be made public before the assembly.
Well, that's very reassuring. Thank you.
Thanks, Tina. I mean, we probably could go on and on the question of women. Maybe we should have a whole other webinar on just that, but there are other things to go on to. So we're moving our way through the main sections of the document. And the second one is about processes and is partly to do with formation. And I find that very interesting because we talk about the importance of listening and learning to listen to people and learning to help people express their views, but without formation, we can't really engage with people's views. Is that right? I mean, there has to be formation in order for people to be able to express views that we can kind of lock in with. Is that, sorry, I don't think I'm explaining myself very well, but you see what I mean?
I think what the document says, and in this it really is reflecting the Synod journey so far, that there is this general call and desire for formation for, as it were, ordinary people, what they call an integral and shared formation, that each baptized person is called to take care of that formation. But obviously there's also a responsibility on the part of the church to provide it. And I think if we take this part of the document seriously, we are talking about a major investment of the church's resources in the formation of lay people in the future. And I think that shouldn't be overlooked. But what is the formation that's being called for? Well, interestingly, it says actually part of it's understanding the action of the Spirit in the church's history. So, just to understand, as it were, the role of the Spirit, but formation specifically in listening. Through the conversation in the Spirit method, we need people who know how to do that and how to accompany. Also, formation in listening to the poor and the excluded. How do we integrate those voices which have been excluded? Formation in forming witnesses, in the capacity for encounters and sharing. So it's multifaceted. That's the formation we're talking about.
Rennie, do you? I think as a mother, well, I certainly as a mother, I feel that, I mean, my children are now in their 20s, but I feel I have somehow terribly failed in their formation. But I'm not quite clear whether it's me who's failed or the parish or the school, the Catholic schools. I think it's a really hard thing to get right.
Absolutely. And you wouldn't be the only parent who said that, Maggie. Formation is multidimensional. I think we are talking about a specific kind of formation in this document, but of course, formation is at the heart of what it means to be Christian. So at the moment of baptism, the whole person is open to the grace of God in every experience in their life, but it can go terribly wrong, or it can even go just a little bit wrong and correct itself later on. Many great saints have been atheists at some point before they realized that, before they had a radical encounter with Christ. And I think at the heart of formation is probably opening up the way to that radical encounter, which then helps us to change from within. Part of that encounter, I think, that we're trying to work toward as a church through synodality is precisely in listening and in hearing God speaking through the voice of the other, even and especially when we disagree. So to come back to Tina's point as well. So what is being said here, if I have this, if I'm disagreeing with what is being said, it is still very important that I am hearing what is being said. And then something is happening to me as that happens, because I'm not shutting it out, but I am listening. And how is it that God is speaking to me through that listening? So it's a specific kind of aspect of formation, I think, that we're trying to flex our muscles on here in synodality. There would be other kinds of formation that we could talk about, but the formation that has to do with synodality, as it says in the document, it happens through a diverse range of methods in the church for listening, dialogue, and discernment, arising from different cultures and spiritual traditions. And it is important to promote formation in this plurality of methods, as well as dialogue between them in local contexts. I do think that we need to do a bit more work on figuring out what that is, because we're using one particular method right now, and there are a whole range more. So I would be very hopeful that into the future, synodality would not be defined as only conversations in the Spirit, but as a style of being church that embraces all kinds of formation in listening and dialogue.
Mhm.
and in group discernment. There's a lot there. So if you can, we need to reimagine the way we do things in parish level, at diocesan level, at deanery level, that rather than simply conducting everything as if it's a business meeting, a corporate business meeting, we need to actually all be involved in, asking constantly, what is the Spirit asking of us in this place? What is our mission? What are we being called for? And to learn that everybody needs to speak. We need to hear everybody, because it's from listening to people's experience and including those on the outside and so on, that we begin to see what the Spirit is calling us to. So it's that kind of a way of proceeding which the document is saying we need formation in.
Mm. So we have got some questions coming in and the minutes are ticking away. So I'm going to give you each a question rather than one question for both of you. So somebody wants to know, Austin, you wrote about a visit to Knock in the west of Ireland, that the Irish Church was the site of the original thinking on deep reform and evangelization. The limited engagement of local Irish parishes with the Synod might suggest otherwise.
Yes, I think the experience in Ireland has been just like the experience in England, that many parishes, many dioceses did it badly, many didn't want to know about it, many parish priests didn't want to know. But look, we can go over all that story. The truth is that the experience of synodality that ordinary people have had so far is extremely patchy, as you, Maggie, were saying at the beginning. And as I keep saying, we're just at the beginning of this journey. We're just taking the first baby steps. What impressed me at Knock was that they really got the point about the reaching out to the seekers and the searchers and making a place, a spiritual center that was really all about that. I felt that was far ahead. I'm also really impressed with the Irish synodal reports that have been submitted to Rome, each diocese, putting synodality into practice. And I did, in an article in the Tablet, contrast that with the response of I thought the bishops of England and Wales, where we had very, very little of that, no examples of that. And that's why I highlighted that in the article.
Oh, so we're running out of time. So very, very quickly, Rennie, this is a question from Jane. You say that you're speaking from experience, but also speaking on behalf of others from your continent. How do you find the balance between the two? How do you get it right?
Yeah, that's right. How do we get it right? I'm not really sure that I'll ever get anything right in my life, but so getting the balance, I think that it's a matter of when a question is raised, thinking through a lot of the conversations that we've had. So what I didn't mention earlier was that I was actually part of the drafting process for the Oceania submission. And during that, it might just be helpful to touch on a point that I think Austin alluded to earlier, this whole work of synthesis. The work of synthesis is not of summarizing, but it's actually of discerning what has been heard in the various different submissions. So looking for moments of convergence, divergence, really picking up on what some of the key pastoral concerns are. So it's almost like, when I met with my beautiful fellow delegates from Oceania, hearing from, in particular, the women who are working in various areas of the church in Fiji and Papua New Guinea, in the various French-speaking islands, and realizing just some of their concerns are very similar to my own as a woman in the church, as a mother, as a working mum, all of this kind of thing, but also appreciating that there are cultural differences. And then getting the balance right is, I think, partially saying, actually, I don't know what that's like. Can you tell me more? Or going out and seeking more information. So I think that's one way of trying to achieve the balance. But of course, it's difficult because we're all formed by our own experiences, and we need to be, I think, always very conscious of that.
Right. Amanda, can you tell me what time we have to wind up? Because I'm conscious that there are now questions coming in.
You go on as long as you want, Maggie.
Well, we just take two questions rather quickly. One is from Tina. Can you unmute, Tina? Can you unmute?
Sorry, I don't want to hog this, but I have just a quick question. I took part in a discussion on formation with some religious sisters in Namibia a couple of weeks ago. And I was very careful because I'm very respectful of culture. So I didn't go down any feminist road. But actually, when they realized we were in a trusted conversation, it's hard to describe the grief and rage that came out. And the point was, we are in a patriarchal culture. Help us to make our voices heard. So it's very nice to talk about listening in different cultures, but as long as the bishops are the gatekeepers, how are you going to persuade the bishops to listen to those sisters crying out to be heard? And believe me, they were more radical than I am in what they wanted to say.
So can we,
So
Austin, can you answer, can you give an answer of like 30 seconds to that? Otherwise we're going to not get to the next.
How do we persuade bishops to listen to those voices, I think
Yes.
is your question. Well, I think the answer is there are bishops who listen and there are bishops who struggle to listen. And this journey that we're all on, this journey of synodality, is a journey of conversion. What struck me at last year's assembly, and I'm sure it struck me again, is how many bishops actually are really through this learning to listen. And many of them told me, that they had never done this before. They'd never done conversations in the Spirit. One of the most memorable lines from one of the facilitators was, "Excuse me, Cardinal, she hasn't finished yet."
Yeah. Okay, great. And then Barbara asks, throughout my life, there's been an increasing awareness of the joys and riches of contemplative prayers. We do not hear too much about this from the pulpit. Within the synod, is there sorry, and then the question trails off, but I think you can see where it's going. Rennie, is there any space for talking about types of prayer, or is that not, that's...
Absolutely. And I think not only talking about it, but practicing it as much as possible during the assembly. So there are moments of prayer, moments of silence. As you can see, we're beginning with a retreat. We've had of course, the great privilege of so many hours with Timothy Radcliffe, who comes from a deep tradition of prayer, the Dominican tradition of prayer and preaching. We are surrounded by religious who come from various different traditions on the floor, and across the time, so at daily mass and at various points throughout, we have the opportunity to really honor some of the saints and some of the deep prayer traditions in the liturgical calendar. So
Lovely.
very much present. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. In 2 minutes, I've got one final question. Each of you perhaps could give a brief answer. What difference would it make to the Synod if Pope Francis died now?
Yeah, that's a question I get asked a lot. I think if he died right now, when the assembly is about to start on Monday, I have no idea, frankly, how they would operate. I don't, however, think that synodality will die with this pontificate. I think it's a genie that's been let out of the bottle that can't be put back. And I think we experience now a church already on the move. Here's actually a thought to leave you with. At the next conclave, which I assume will be after the synod, the next conclave, the cardinals will gather. Many of them, of course, 45 of them will have been at the synod assembly. They will have been part of this process. The whole process of electing a pope will be different as a result of the synod on synodality, because the largest ever consultation in human history will have taken place. The people of God, will have spoken in all these different ways, and I think that will necessarily shape both the way they elect the pope and the man who emerges on the balcony of St. Peter's afterwards. It's already, in other words, changed the future of the church.
Rennie?
So the question is, what would happen if the Holy Father passed away right now? I think practically speaking, that's a question
Well, it doesn't
that
have to
we
be right now, but I mean, between now and Christmas, I mean, say, soon.
Or after this.
Yeah, I agree with Austin. It's not as though things are going to stop. So just recalling that synodality, the process of synodality is itself formative. I don't know what happens behind the closed doors of the conclave, but I would hope that the cardinals would be taking in with them more understanding of the global church, of the pastoral needs of the global church, and that with all of that in mind, that they would be discerning together who it is we need to take us forward so that we can continue to be a listening church and a church that is radically formed by an encounter with Christ.
Great. Thank you both very much. And thank you everybody who's come, especially Tina, for your, it's really great to have you here asking the tough questions that need to be asked. So I'll hand over to Amanda to wrap up.
Thank you, Maggie.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Notre Dame University Australia for sponsoring this particular webinar. Thanks to our speakers, Professor Renee Kohler-Ryan, Dr. Austin Ivory, and to Maggie. And we also hope that Professor Anna Rowlands gets better soon. Coming up with the tablet, we've finished our sort of series now of September webinars, but we've got a whole host of new webinars coming up for October, including something that we picked up from Austin Ivory's last time he was on a webinar about faithful citizenship. Our listeners wanted to unpack that a little bit more, so we'll be covering faithful citizenship on the 2nd of October. On the 9th of October, we're talking about the legacy of Vatican II, 60 years on, and synodality. And we have Professor Massimio Fagiolo, who will be...
Fagioli, Amanda, Fagioli.
Austin, it's perfect having you on this call to help me out. On Wednesday, the 16th of October, we've got our tablet lecture. That's a live lecture at CCLA offices in London. So please, if you can come to that, we'd be delighted to see as many of you at that lecture as possible. It's not just the lecture, it's the social with the tablet team. So please do come along to that. And then on Wednesday, the 23rd, we'll be looking at the beauty in the visual arts. That's faith and beauty. And we're hoping to get Father Patrick van der Vost again for that one. So please do look out on the website. If you're not a subscriber to the tablet, then please do look on www.thetablet.co.uk. And if you've not contributed to the development campaign, it's coming to an end at the end of October, so you've still got time to do that, and you just need to go on the website. All the details are there. Thank you once again for such a stimulating conversation. We'll be covering more on the Synod in future webinars, but from now, from myself and from Maggie and from our speakers, we'd just like to wish you a very good evening. Good night.
Thank you. See you soon, Austin.
See ya.
Bye.